I think we could begin. If Daniele, can you please confirm that you're hearing us okay?
Yes, I'm hearing you. You can start. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, welcome everybody to the fourth event, the third lecture in this pioneering Astini Spring Lecture Series. And our lecture tonight is by Janet Starkey, and it's entitled Travel Accounts by Marco Polo, Odoric and Mandeville as Natural History, Strange Plants, Animals and Monsters. Janet is a former lecturer in anthropology at Durham University. She's also a founder member of Astini and will be known to many people attending tonight as a founder member and also a former treasurer of Astini. Not all of this lecture is entirely serious. Some of the creatures described, even some of the people, never existed at all. It's a lecture that's intended to be fun, as well as providing some information. We're all in need, I think, of a little bit of light-hearted scholarship during lockdown. So let us enjoy this lecture, which will take us on a journey of the fantastical. If you have any questions that you'd like to put to Janet to be looked at, or comments, questions or comments, you can use the Q&A facility on your screen, and then these will be picked up after the lecture. So I'll now, without any further ado, hand you over to Janet.
Well, good evening, everybody. I'll start away. When Astini was founded in 1997, following two successful international conferences on travellers to and from Egypt and the Near East at the universities of Durham and of Oxford, one of its members' aims was to use and compare travellers' accounts of archaeological sites, modes of travel, various routes used, landscapes and environments, and people they met on the way. This follows an already established tradition. For example, the Hungarian-British early 20th century archaeologist Sir Aurel Stein read Marco Polo's travellers closely to try to locate abandoned sites along the Silk Roads. In 2017, a two-day conference was held at the Royal Botanic Garden in Edinburgh entitled Travellers in Ottoman Lands, to consider the botanical legacy of travellers. Following on from that conference, today, when 1 in 4 of the world's mammals and over 40% of amphibians are threatened with extinction due to human activity, it is worth trying to discover what the natural environment, flora and fauna were like as described and illustrated in medieval travel accounts, such as those of Marco Polo, Sir John Mandeville and Odoric of Pordenone, the first two being the most widely disseminated secular texts about lands beyond Europe of the period. They were certainly fantastic elements in their works, monsters, marvels and mirabilia. However, if much of what Marco Polo and Odoric reported, for example, is true, then their works are an important source of knowledge about plants and animals, not just for trade and exploitation, but increasingly today for identifying and protecting endangered species and environments across the Middle East and Asia, before it is all just too late. It's not moving along. Yeah. The starting point of this, I'll try and close this down. Oh, it's okay, isn't it? The starting point of this talk is a wonderful bound collection of travel accounts involving the Orient, now held at the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. It was one of three of the most sumptuous, illuminated manuscripts of the Middle Ages, the fabulous Le Livre de Merveille du Monde, created between 1410 and 1412 in France. It had 297 folios. It was 42 by 29.8 centimeters. It was commissioned by Jean Saint-Père, Duc de Bourgogne, who died in 1419, as a gift for his uncle Jean, Duke of Berry, in 1413, and was subsequently owned by a long succession of prominent French figures and families. Most of the text in Le Livre, as I'll call it, were translated into vernacular French by a Benedictine monk, Jean Le Long. The whole manuscript is illustrated in the same fabulous style, and it's a very good manuscript for us to have a look at. Marco Polo account of his travels is the first text in Le Livre, and it dates to 1410 to 1412. Variously called De Million, De Versement du Monde, Le Livre de Merveille du Monde, his travels recounted a journey of about 24,000 kilometers through the Mongol Empire and around Asia. He described many other cultures he encountered on his journey firsthand, or so people think. Le Livre de Merveille includes two other travel accounts that are the foci of this talk. First, Odoric de Pordenone, itinerum, and he was a Franciscan missionary who set off from Venice in 1318, reached China in 1320 via the Persian Gulf, and returned to Udine in 1330 to relate his itinerum to his fellow friars in Udine, and he died the following year. Several of Odoric's episodes bear close resemblance to those by Marco Polo. Sir Henry Yule translated Odoric's account in 1866 as The Travellers of Friar Odoric. So there you see the frontispiece of his section of the book. Secondly, so we've got Marco Polo, we've now Odoric, and this is the next one. The Voyage de John Mandeville are included in Le Livre. This incredibly popular travel account first circulated around Europe between 1356 and 1371. The supposed author, a physician of Liège called Johann de Bourgogne, who died in 1372, appropriated and embellished accounts by others to fabricate Mandeville's wondrous explorations. Yet by the late Middle Ages, Mandeville, master of hearsay evidence, was more popular than Marco Polo. He was a completely fictional figure. Samuel Purchas even suggested that Odoric had stolen from Mandeville, whom the latter cites as his travelling companion. Of course, that all leads to speculation. Did any of them really travel there, or did any of them really exist? John Greenlee's recent Mapping Mandeville project has revealed how closely Mandeville's book mimics the Hereford Mappa Mundi. Mandeville was supposed to have travelled between 1322 and 1356 to China and Egypt, but of course was a fictional creation who never travelled at all. And there you see the Mappa Mundi, and the blue dots on the left are places that have been identified in the Mandeville account. Another major project on the book of John Mandeville, edited by Tamara Kochansky and David Benson, was published in 2007 and revealed over 40 main sources for Mandeville's book. They included a history of the Holy Land from the advent of Islam to the time of the Crusades, entitled Historia Orientalis. I'm not going to read all this list of 40, by Jacques de Vitry, who was Bishop of Acre from 1214, who travelled extensively in Egypt and the Holy Land, returning to Europe in 1225. Of course, just to confuse everyone further, there are at least 150 versions of Marco Polo's accounts, over 300 manuscripts of Mandeville, and 73 Odorics, all in a range of languages. So it's really a life's work for somebody to disentangle this network of intertextual sources. Included in Le Livre were several other notable travel accounts, all of which were major sources used by Mandeville. The first part of Mandeville's book, especially on Constantinople and the Holy Land, relied on a pilgrim account by the German Dominican friar Wilhelm von Boldensal, who travelled in the Middle East between 1332 and 1336. Mandeville relied on Odoric's account for much of his texts from chapter 13 onwards. Also bound in the volume Es Fleur de l'Histoire de la Terre de l'Orient, about the histories of the Orient, completed by an Armenian nobleman and monk, Hayton of Corcaius, and another book by Ricoldo de Monte de Croce, who travelled around the Holy Land and the Middle East, both sources for Mandeville too. I won't go on giving, but you get the general idea. There's lots of different sources. So what about the illustrations of this book? Clearly, there's a disparity in time between the various texts, as you've been mentioned above, and the experiences of the illustrators of Le Livre de Merveille, who probably had very little first-hand experience of the Orient, so had difficulty in transcribing the text correctly into iconographic language. The 265 illustrations, 84 are from the Polo text alone, are miniatures by various Parisian workshops. Artists include Bouquillon, master, who's probably the Flemish illustrator Jacques Cohen, Mazarin, master, and the Egerton and Bedford master craftsmen. Embellished with gold, the images reflected the opulence of the Orient, emphasized its marvels and monsters, and visual depository of fabulous flora and fauna. The magnificence of the Livre honored the courts of its patrons. Of course, there were other illuminated manuscripts that include some of our travellers' accounts too. I'll try and close that. For example, there's one in the Bodleian, the Romance of Alexander, which is in Flemish, which was bound in with Marco Polo's Le Livre de Grande Crime, with an excellent illustrations by Johannes and his school in about 1400. And then there's another one called the Paris Arsenal 5169, and here you can see several examples, which is of a different quality, though its pictures reflect Marco Polo's text more closely than the FR 2810, which is the one I've just been talking about, favouring the idea of the everyday over the splendour of the latter. Thus, we find Marco Polo's crocodiles modestly depicted in Arsenal 5169, but are winged dragons in 58281. Now we see some of the dragons, and the crocodiles with just two legs on the left, on the right, transformed into dragons on the left. So what about Marco Polo? Niccolo Polo and his brother Maffeo Polo travelled to China from Constantinople in 1259 or 1260, arriving in Beijing in 1266, which was the seat of Kublai Khan. They returned to Venice in 1269 and undertook a second trip to China between 1271 and 1295, accompanied by Marco, Niccolo's 17-year-old son. On his return to Venice, Marco was imprisoned in Genoa for about 3 years. During his imprisonment, he recounted his fabulous adventures to a fellow prisoner, Rustichello da Pisa, an Arthurian romance author and traveller. Rustichello wrote The Travellers in Old French, mixed with a sprinkling of Franco-Italian, Old Venetian, and Old Pisan, and it was finished by 1298. It was first published in Franco-Italian as De Versement du Monde, Description of the World, in 1299, and it only appeared in English in 1579. There are two major translations of Marco Polo's text into English, both translators having travelled extensively as members of the East India Company. The first is William Marsden, who published it as The Travels of Marco Polo the Venetian in 1818. The second, published in 1871, was the Book of Sir Marco Polo by Scottish Orientalist Sir Henry Yule, with a new edition in 1913, jointly edited by Yule and the French sinologist Henri Cordier. Marsden, Yule, and Cordier, these translators, provided detailed explanatory footnotes on every aspect of the text, including flora and fauna. So what about the flora and fauna, the main point of my paper? Knowledge of Asiatic flora and fauna was greatly increased as a result of the works included in the livre. An empirical observer, Marco Polo described an extraordinary variety of plants and animals, including camels, giraffes, falcons, pheasants and partridges, wild horses and asses of Persia, lions in the Oxus Valley, large porcupines, elephants, monkeys, and crocodiles, who he described as giant sharp-clawed serpents. There was mountain cattle, zebu, naked barley, fat-tailed sheep that make up today 25% of the world's sheep population, and Marco Polo sheep, a subspecies of Argali sheep. One could go on. And so many elephants on every turn. They've got elephants arriving in Hormuz. You've got armies of the Khan attacking the rebellious king of Meen. We've got Zanzibari elephants everywhere, and very cute elephants they are too. Odoric took pleasure in noting the bizarre, the unusual, and incredible. As Chayo Kiesu describes in Odoric's book, along the road, one after the other, Odoric comes upon mountains of salt, impenetrable deserts, crocodiles, mice as big as dogs, men with extremely long testicles, trees that produce bread, fantastic palaces, magic fish, snakes, elephants, leeches, bamboo reeds, sensational pearls, gigantic tortoises, birds of unusual appearance, men with the head of a dog, hens covered in wool, and lambs born of melons. Like Marco Polo, Odoric was substantially truthful, I think. He repeatedly reassures the reader that he would not have believed the tales himself if he had not experienced matters firsthand. As the English poet John Mandeville wrote in his introduction to Marsden's translation of Marco Polo's Travellers, "Travellers who see marvellous things, even in our own day, are seldom believed by those who, having stayed at home, have all the consequences of their virtue. It may be thought that many travellers have given their readers great imaginative possessions, but the imaginative possession is not measured in miles and parasangs, nor do the people of that country write accounts of birds and beasts. It's only the wonderful traveller who sees a wonder." So let's have a look at some of the things that they discovered and found. At the start of his journey, Marco Polo travelled along from the shores of the Black Sea through territory controlled by the Mongols, and with an eye to commercial opportunities, he noted that the Abkhazian forests of boxwood in the province of what's now Georgia, he said, the general wood of the country is the box tree. Quite straightforward. This small evergreen tree mostly grows in the coastal region of Marmara and the Black Sea regions of Turkey, along with what now remains of groves of beech, oak, hornbeam, and chestnut. These boxwood reserves were commercially valuable to the Genoese and the Venetians, as its wood is hard as iron. So we start off with him being aware of commercial opportunities of plants that he's observing. Sometimes they say that it's hard to track the routes that Marco Polo took, but certainly through the sections of when he traveled through Persia, it seems relatively easy to track his route. After Marco Polo left the shores of the Black Sea, he crossed the Elbrus Mountains and visited Tabriz, Kashan, and Kerman. And you can see I've marked it in blue there. Then traveled south via the Girov Plain and on towards Hormuz before traveling further east. Odoric and Mandeville said they'd visited Hormuz too. It would have taken Marco Polo 7 days across the plains from Yezd to Kerman, 9 to cover the 150 kilometers to Kamandu, and another 9 days to Hormuz. As Marco Polo described, the road from Yezd to Kerman lies through extensive groves of date-bearing palm, in which there's abundance of game, as well as beasts as partridges and quails. Wild asses are likewise to be met with, very numerous and handsome. Little has changed by 1850. Consul Abbott, who travelled through the area, found a plain about 2,000 feet above sea level that was partly wooded, with thickets of reeds abounding with francolin and Giarjufi partridge. The land yields grain, millet, pulse, French and horse beans, rice, cotton, henna, Parma Christi, and dates, and is part of a great fertility. The rainy seasons from January to March, after which there's a luxuriant crop of grass. By 1880, partridges, quails, and wild asses still abounded. In 1961, the great traveller Tim Severin, who died last year, traced Marco Polo's route through the Del Bahi Pass, as you see here, which reached a height of 2,440 meters, onto the Girjov Plain and on towards Hormuz in search of Marco Polo's Persian apples of paradise. This route took Marco Polo to a district called Reobali, as Marco Polo describes it. The temperature of the plain is very warm. It produces wheat, rice, and other grains. On that part of it which lies nearest the hills, dates, pomegranates, quinces, and a variety of other fruits grow amongst which is one called Adam's apple. This is what Tim Severin was trying to define, not known in our cold climate. Turtle doves are found here in vast numbers. Here are likewise many pheasants and francolins, which latter do not resemble those of other countries, their colour being a mixture of white and black with red legs and beak. So what is this Adam's apple or apple of paradise? According to Marsden in 1818, the apple of paradise was a type of citrus, a bitter orange, the fruit the Persians called naranj. Whilst in Cairo, Mandeville found bananas or plantains called long apples of paradise, repeating William von Bolsonel's earlier account of bananas that he found in Palestine in 1322, and quote, an elongated fruit called the apple of paradise, having a wonderful taste and soft so that it melts easily in the mouth. More plausibly, General Sir Albert Houghton Schlinder of the Persian Telegraph Service asserted that the apple of paradise inland from Hormuz was the pretty red fruit of the sacred konna, jujube or lota tree, as you can see here. Odoric merely stated about this whole area that inland India, which is what he meant by Persia, you find people who live almost entirely on dates. You get 42 pounds of dates for less than a groat. Very practical. Whilst, in contrast, Mandeville describes a city inland from Hormuz called Cambay with, quote, a great plenty of parrots, as there are larks in our country. In this country there's a little wheat or barley, and therefore they eat millet and rice, honey and milk and cheese and all sorts of fruits. In that land are many parrots. Those that talk well have long, broad tongues and 5 toes on each foot. Those that do not talk at all or not much have only 3 toes. I don't know much about parrots, but somebody knows whether this is true or not. Now to come to another strange plant, the hybrid melon lamb plants. There are very few irrational marvels or monsters in Marco Polo's or Oderic's accounts. Whenever they mentioned monsters, they clearly distinguished between what they had heard from anything they'd actually experienced. Marco Polo described cotton growing abundantly in Persia, so it's somewhat surprising, seeing that Odoric tended to read what Marco Polo had written, to find a strange description in Oderic's chapter 43, entitled Concerning a Certain Melon That Produceth a Beast Like a Lamb. This chapter is set in the Caucasus. Quote, another marvelous thing that may be related, which, however, saw not myself, but heard from trustworthy persons. There be mountains called the Caspian Mountains, on which are said to grow certain very large melons. And when these be ripe, they burst, and a little beast is found inside like a little lamb. So they have both melons and meat. That's one of the melon trees you can see on the right. This melon hybrid melon lamb is also mentioned by Mandeville. Quote, the men eat both the fruit and the beast. Of the fruit I've eaten, though it were wonderful, but I know that well that God is marvelous in his works. It was, after all, just cotton, and he certainly wouldn't have been eating cotton, and he didn't exist at all. Let's look at another strange description, one that possibly has more credibility. In his chapter 7, Mandeville recounted, in Egypt be gardens that have trees and herbs, that which bear fruit 7 times in the year. And there's a common house in that city, this is Cairo, that is all full of small furnaces, and thither bring women of the town the iron of hens, of geese, or ducks, for to be put into those furnaces. And they that keep house cover them with the heat of horse dung, without a hen, goose, or duck, or any fowl. At the end of 3 weeks or a month, they come again and take their chickens and flourish them and bring them forth, so that all the country is full of them. According to Professor Salma Ikram, chickens were part of the Egyptian diet from the time of the Ptolemaic dynasty, and Diodorus Siculus thought them wondrous. Simonian Samanius, on pilgrimage there between 1322 and 1323, saw, quote, on the left of the road leading to Cairo is a long and narrow house in which countless numbers, about 2,000 to 3,000, he estimated, of chickens are produced by the help of fire from the eggs of hens, without the presence of the latter or of cocks. In this house, on each side, the earth is raised for the length of the building to the height of an altar, and ovens or furnaces are arranged in which are placed an innumerable quantity of eggs, to which uniform and temperate heat is continually applied day and night for 22 or 23 days. Reaumur, an expert on insects in France in the 18th century, corresponded with Consul Lemaire in Cairo about these mythical ovens, and published, in the result of these findings, published his own design for egg incubators in France in 1750. Most late subsequent sources say that it was Reaumur, but I don't believe he actually went. I think he corresponded with various people and read about them. And here you see an illustration in Aviculture Europe and a picture from 1833 of an egg incubator. Now for monsters and mythical beasts. In medieval Europe, European imagination, the East was on the limits of outer limits of experience, a place of the supernatural, a place for extreme holiness and contrarily unholiness. Accounts of medieval travels invoked marvels to amazed readers, and monsters must have roamed at large in the dreams of readers. Thus, illustrations in our wonderful manuscript FR 2810 included unicorns, lions, griffins, crocodiles, serpents, and winged dragons, as well as various fantastic monstrous humans, including headless men, blemmies, sciapods, and cyclops, some lacking limbs, heads, or eyes, other a mixture of animals and humans, including dog-headed creatures and centaurs. Here you see them fighting griffins in the Bactrian desert of Central Asia. Curiously, though Mandeville describes many of these monsters, they do not appear in Marco Polo's travels, which is contrary to what most people imagine, even though an image showing the mountainous landscape of Bargu is populated by a headless man with his face on his chest. Here you can see the blemmy, a one-footed sciapod in the middle on his back, and a cyclops bearing a club and a buckler. I find these figures again in this, which is a manuscript in the Bodleian, which have included far more different characters of these strange people. Marco Polo's chapter 41 in Marsden's edition describes the wild inhabitants of Bargu, perhaps near the lake of Baikal in Siberia, but there's no mention of these monsters that appear in this picture in his text. Perhaps the illustration was interleaved in the wrong place, or just added to make the text more interesting to readers. Marco Polo and Odoric marveled at unfamiliar beasts and flora and tried to provide everyday explanations for anything that was new to them. The only hybrid animal-human creatures mentioned by Marco Polo were the dog-headed cynocephali, savages of the Andaman Islands, where the strange and the everyday, for they were cannibals that grew spices, are juxtaposed. Dog-headed creatures were familiar to the ancient Greeks from the ancient Egyptian gods, of course. The Alexander romances were, according to Henri Cordier, the source of tales about these dog-headed men. These dog-headed men were mentioned by Odoric in his chapter 24, and you see his image on the left, where he found them on the Isle of the Nicovarian, where the men have dogs' faces. And Mandeville found them in the Nicobar Islands, whilst Ibn Battuta, who was traveling just around this time too, described people with dog-like mouths on an island between India and Sumatra. There's only one other mythical beast described by Marco Polo, a unicorn in Java. This is how he described them. Quote, "There are wild elephants in the country and numerous unicorns, which are very nearly as big. They have hair like a buffalo, feet like those of an elephant, and a horn in the middle of their forehead, which is black and very thick. This beast, no doubt a rhinoceros, that Latin for a rhinoceros is Rhinoceros unicornus, was a species of animal new to Marco Polo, and also to Albrecht Dürer when he drew one in 1515. It was not a delicate unicorn provided by the illustrators of FR 2810, which we see here. You see these unicorns, nor the classical representation as we see on the left here, as shown on the Nile Delta of the Hereford Mappamundi. Those ones are elegant horses with long ivory tusks, like that of the Arctic narwhal. So that's in contrast to Marco Polo and Odoric, that's what Marco Polo was interlaced in Marco Polo's text, but it didn't include them. But Mandeville did. He included monsters including monstrous people or monstrous or mythological beasts, dragons, unusual birds, and strange plants. Many of the monsters described by Mandeville can be found in classical texts. For example, Mandeville describes sciapods in Ethiopia. Quote, "In that land too, there are people of different shapes. There are some who have only one foot," and you can see him in the middle there, "and yet they run so fast on that one foot that it's a marvel to see them. The foot is so big that it will cover and shade all the body from the sun." Mandeville imagined further fantastical wonders: monopods, men with eyes in their shoulders, people whose faces are in their chests, mythical beasts and legendary illusions that also populated the Mappa Mundi in Hereford, which of course dates to 1300. Mandeville described the Blemmies as mythical people, mythical headless men who live in remote places. Alexander the Great, the ultimate hero, encounters Blemmies in the Alexander romances in the picture on the left, which is called Historia de Prelims, a fabulous manuscript made in Rouen in about 1445. Pliny the Elder reported that the Blemmies who had no heads, their mouths and eyes being seated in their breasts, lived somewhere in Ethiopia or near Nubia. According to Herodotus, the Blemmies lived on the eastern edges of the ancient Libya or Ethiopia, along with dog-headed Cynophili. In 12, you can see a bit of the Mappa Mundi there, right at the edge, at the bottom of the map of Mundi, showing them the Blemmies. In 2004, the archaeologist Hans Bernard concluded that the modern Bija of the eastern deserts of Egypt and the Sudan are the true descendants of the Blemmies, a nomadic tribe in Roman times. But of course, none of them were headless. Although not calling them Blemmies, Mandeville had them in the Andaman Islands. Quote, "There are many different kinds of people in these isles. In one, there's a race of great stature, like giants, foul and horrible to look at. They have only one eye only in the midst of their foreheads. They eat raw flesh and raw fish. In another part, there are ugly folk without heads, who have eyes on each shoulder. Their mouths are round like a horseshoe in the middle of their chest." Elsewhere, in the Andaman Islands of Denua, Mandeville describes headless men with eyes and mouths in their backs. Marco Polo did describe one strange beast, the ruch, a bird of prodigious dimensions living in Madagascar. It was possibly a mythical griffin. Marco Polo didn't claim to have seen it himself. Rather, the people of the island report that at a certain season of the year, an extraordinary kind of bird, which they call a ruch, makes its appearance from the southern region. It was for all the world like an eagle, but one indeed of enormous size, so big in fact that its quills were 12 paces long and thick in proportion, and it is so strong that it will seize an elephant in its talons. It became the mystical bird of the Hindu legends and, of course, appears in the Arabian Nights. Marsden, the translator of Marco Polo, wondered if it was just a well-travelled albatross that was magnified into a monster. Myths surrounding Alexander the Great, whose expedition to Asia ended in 326 BC, haunt medieval travellers' accounts. The Alexander romances provided a corpus of tales about the East that echoed through Mandeville's imaginary journeys in the East. For example, in his chapters 7 and 32, Alexander came across a mystical tree that bore neither trees, leaves, nor fruit, on which sat a phoenix, a mythical classical symbol of immortality. Then Alexander came to the trees of the sun and the moon, where he consulted the oracle and learned his destiny. This tale echoed Marco Polo's description of the arbor sol, arbor secco, a dry and fruitless tree on the borders of Persia. This was probably a solitary large chinar, Latin Platanus orientalis, an important tree in Persian gardens. Old chinars often grow near mosques, cemeteries, or other sacred sites, and some are popularly expected to work miracles. Odoric heard of an arbo secco in a mosque in Tabriz. An ancient chinar still grows in the bazaar in Vodil near the Uzbek-Kyrgyz frontier. Several hundred years old, some say that Alexander the Great rested in its shade. In the extreme east of the Hereford Mapamundi is the legend Arbor Basilimi id est arbor sicca. In other words, this is a balsamy tree, that is the dry tea. In 1908, John Mandeville summed it up very well. In the east of Romance there grows the tree of the sun or dry tree, by which Marco Polo passed, a sort of landmark or milestone at the end of the great desert. The apples of the sun and the moon grow upon that tree. Darius and Alexander fought in its shade. Those are the significant facts about the tree according to Marco Polo. We moderns, who care little for any tree, as soon as we murmur its Latin name, have lost wonder in losing faith. Right, to conclude, I've given you a whole cacophony of strange beasts and ordinary crops and flowers and flora. Climate change affects the flora and fauna of any region, and many of those mentioned by the three travellers are under threat. Today, the Persian onagar is listed as endangered by the IUCN Red List, and the species is close to extinction. The chinar declining in Shiraz and other parts of Iran due to fungal attack, canker stain, stem canker and lacebug, and also overcutting. Unfortunately, in August 2011, Russian botanists discovered that the protected boxwood groves near Sochi and Abkhazia were being destroyed by an incurable fungal disease. European turtle doves are listed as a vulnerable species due to habit destruction and overhunting. Are there any lions left in the Oxus Valley? Certainly the Caspian tiger was extinct by 2003, and the Asiatic lion is vulnerable to extinction. The Rhinoceros unicornis has been listed in appendix of the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora since 1975. Snow tigers and leopards are all under threat, as are Marco Polo's sheep. Elephant birds, Marco Polo's ruch, lived in Madagascar until their extinction in the 17th century, if that's to be believed. Of course, several species and creatures mentioned by these travellers never existed at all. True to form, Mandeville described the Cedars of Lebanon. The mountains of Lebanon stretch to the desert of Faran, separating the kingdom of Syria and the country of Phoenicia, which is Phoenicia. On those hills, very tall cedars grow, and they bear long apples, which are as big as a man's head. He always likes to exaggerate. Of course, this is a species at risk in the model world too, and it's the subject of next fortnight's esteemed spring lecture to be given by Paul Starkey. Thank you. So, any questions? Any questions?
Any questions? We've had a message of appreciation, but there's something on chat rather than Q&A. No questions, but much appreciation. I've got a question actually. Why are blemmies called blemmies? Where's the name come from?
No idea. Oh, here's a question. Could the headless people have been those who had tattoos on their chest, would always wear grass headdresses so their faces weren't seen? That's a possibility. Of course, the Bija, if they're supposed to be the descendants of the Blemmies, are known to have these enormous hairstyles, like sort of enormous afros. So whether that's part of it, I don't know. Any other questions? No other questions?
Yes, there's something on Q&A.
Okay, here's a question.
Q&A.
Did Jonathan Swift read about these monsters? I would think so, very much so. I think these were very much in circulation, partly because of classical tradition, plus these books were very wide circulation. I was wondering if there was any comments from any Egyptologists about these egg incubators. Any questions? Anyone else? No? A new message here. Are there any other examples of compilations of these three men apart from the? Yes, there's, but quite often they're bound in with a whole variety of different authors. There's several in the Bodleian and the British Library, where one or two of them are bound in, but often with the Alexander romances of the same period. There's very few actually showing all three in the same compilation, and very magnificent. Some people have even thought that Mandeville might have been written by Jean Lelong, who was the translator of these, but the dates don't fit, so that doesn't work at all. Any other questions? Oh, here's some more.
No, those are the two there, I think.
All right, okay.
Yes.
Any other, no more questions? No? Oh, here's something. Turns out that the heat that the eggs are under impacts the gender of the hatching. Oh, that's interesting. It was a medieval Arabic manuscripts and those from the visitors and inhabitants of Egypt. That's interesting. And Jackie said, check out the toponymy on the periphery, place names of the Eastern Desert, Red Sea, and by Julian Cooper on the Blemmies. That's another reference for you all to go off and read. Because there's sense, and here was another one about eggs. You've
done those.
You've done those, yes. Okay. Mm-hmm. Anything else? No, two new messages. So why
do they tend to exaggerate in books which are considered to be non-fictional accounts? Is it all for commercial purposes?
I think in medieval times they enjoyed a good read, and people loved the idea of being amazed with marvels and mirabilia and extraordinary things. So part of it was to sell the books as much as anything. So Lucy's Pollard asked, when was it realized that that Mandeville didn't exist? It was quite late on that they realized. It was circulated that he was the more authoritarian figure and was actually more popular than Marco Polo and Odoric at the time. Okay, here's a nice question from Amanda. A light-hearted question. Which of the fabulous creatures would you like to have been true? Oh, I think the unicorns, don't you? I think they're so beautiful. I think not the rhinoceros, the other ones.
Not the blemmies.
Not the blemmies, no. I gave an earlier version of this account, this talk once, and somebody in the audience greeted me a week later and said they'd had nightmares after all the blemmies and the monsters and the people with eyes in the middle of their foreheads. So I hope you don't all have nightmares. Anything else?
One new message.
Okay. Were any of these accounts seriously challenged at the time? I don't think so. I think people enjoyed reading them. They were well couched in classical tradition, which people tended to believe. I think you get the impression that Marco Polo and Odoric bent over backwards to try and explain anything that was new, and to be open-minded in what they saw. So the way they presented it, it looked as if it was very much true. Right. 2 questions in Q&A. Hold on. Yes, the word blemis comes from Greek and Latin. Yes, that's right.
We've done the other two.
Yes, we've done these. Yes, we've done these.
Yeah.
Anything else? Anybody else got any questions? Whatever.
I think that's it.
I think that's it. Yes, I think we've finished. Yes.
So,
go on.
Well, we're coming up to 9 o'clock anyway, so I think nothing else has come up. So we'll draw the session to a close. We've already had a trailer for the next lecture in 2 weeks' time, when I will be talking about the Cedars of Lebanon, which were reputed to bear long apples, which were as big as a man's head. Well, I think that's, again, another slight exaggeration, but that is the next lecture in 2 weeks' time. And then in 4 weeks' time, we've got Gemma Masson talking about giving an Ottoman lecture. So we've got quite a varied programme, which we've covered so far, and still a bit to come. So thank you very much for attending. I hope you've enjoyed it, and we hope to see you, metaphorically that is, in 2 weeks' time. Thank you very much.